We just want to know what happened.
This episode, I'm getting into the latest with the Nolan Wells case, which is something that a lot of us have been following closely ever since his body was discovered off the coast of Mississippi. What's interesting, though, is there's been a lot of attention on the cell phone, on Nolan's cell phone. Remember, his friends had it, and then his mom was able to get custody of it. It's kind of shocking that now, even more than a month since this whole thing started, the investigators still haven't looked into the cell phone. The family, from what I am hearing, still has not officially handed over the cell phone to investigators. The family wants there to be a joint analysis of the cell phone where they have experts on the family side and then also the FBI and experts from the state all looking at the cell phone and going through the cell phone together. But that still has not happened as of me shooting this video, more than a month after Nolan was discovered, which you would think it would be one of the first things that would get worked out, just because the cell phone may have some critical clues about where Nolan was before, what kind of text messages he was sending, and even if those things were deleted, you're going to find out in this episode they can still be found. So I'm going to dig into the latest on the phone. There is some new information about when the forensic analysis
operated as a team. And since they went out there as a team, and it hasn't been made clear to me whether or not they came back together as a team, all 30 white youth and all 3 boats should have been part of this investigation, not just the one boat. That is my first big issue with this case. Who decided to separate the other 2 boats and the other 20 or so youth? I got a problem with that, Art, because according to the Cajun Navy, they have no GPS information on the other 2 boats, Art. They have no GPS information on the other 2 boats.
40 days. That's how long it's been since Nolan Wells' body washed up on the shore of Horn Island, Mississippi. 40 days since a 4th of July celebration turned into a nightmare his family is still trying to make sense of. And in those 40 days, here's what still hasn't happened. Nobody, not the family's experts, not the state, not the FBI, has been allowed to open his cell phone. Think about that for a second. In almost every modern investigation, the phone is the first thing investigators want. It's the black box. It knows where you were, who you talked to, what you searched, what you deleted, and, sometimes, what you were feeling in your very last hours. And in the Nolan Wells case, that phone has been sitting untouched since the family and investigators agreed, back on July 15th, to examine it together. So today, I want to walk you through exactly where this case stands. We're going to break down the timeline of the phone dispute, minute by minute, letter by letter. I sat down with a digital forensics expert, someone who has spent his career pulling data out of phones just like this one, and asked him directly, after 40 days, is it too late? What can still be found? And what happens to evidence when nobody agrees on who gets to touch it first? Then, because there's a grand jury now involved in this case, I talked to a judge to break down what a grand jury actually is, why it's so secretive, and why, even though it can feel deeply unfair to a grieving family, that secrecy might actually be the thing protecting the integrity of this case. If you've been following the Nolan Wells story, you already know how much confusion, speculation, and outright misinformation has surrounded it. My goal in this channel has always been the same: separate what we actually know from what people are guessing. So let's get into it. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe now, because I promise you, the moment there's real movement on this phone or this grand jury, I'll have it here first. Let's start at the beginning, because if you're just finding this case, you deserve the full picture before we get into the phone. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. On the 4th of July, he was out with a group of friends celebrating on Horn Island, a barrier island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, the kind of place locals and boaters treat as an unofficial holiday gathering spot. Islands, boats, fireworks, a big group of teenagers enjoying one of the biggest party nights of the summer. At some point that night, Nolan went missing. 2 days later, his body was found on the shoreline. And here's the thing that has haunted this case from day one. Nobody has been able to give a clear, consistent account of what happened between the moment Nolan was last seen and the moment his body was recovered. Not the friends who were with him, not the boat's operator, not anyone. In the weeks since, this case has exploded into a national story. not just because of the tragedy itself, but because of everything that has unfolded around it. A private, inconclusive autopsy commissioned by the family, a public dispute over a distress call, viral videos claiming to show the boat's movements that night, attorney Ben Crump stepping in to represent the family, the NAACP getting involved, and now a grand jury. But underneath all of that noise, there is one piece of evidence that keeps coming up again and again as potentially the most important: Nolan's cell phone. And that's what we need to talk about, because more than a month later, it still hasn't been forensically examined. Before we get into the timeline of the dispute, I want you to understand why experts keep pointing back to this phone as the key to the whole case. Nolan was a teenager. And if you have a teenager in your life, or if you remember being a teenager in the smartphone era, you know that basically every part of the day gets filtered through a phone. Group chats, Snapchat stories, location sharing apps like Life 360, photos and videos taken in the moment, sometimes deleted seconds later. Every single one of those digital breadcrumbs could tell investigators something about where Nolan was, who he was with, what he was doing, and what he, or someone else, did with that phone after he went missing. Nolan's mother has said in interviews that when she got access to the phone the night he went missing, there was nothing in the Snapchat history for that day, which she said struck her as suspicious. That single detail, on its own, doesn't prove anything. Snapchat histories can be incomplete for a lot of ordinary reasons. But it's exactly the kind of detail that a full forensic examination could either explain or blow wide open. And right now, nobody outside the family has been able to look at it directly. That's the stakes we're talking about. Not just what texts did he send, but potentially the entire timeline of his final hours, reconstructed from data most people don't even realize their phones are quietly recording. Stage 3. The timeline of the dispute. So let's lay out exactly how we got here, because the back and forth over this phone has been going on for weeks, and it's easy to lose track of the details. On July 15th, the Wells family and investigators reached an agreement. There would be a joint forensic examination of Nolan's phone. Not investigators taking it and running their own analysis in isolation. A joint exam, with experts representing the family sitting in the same room as investigators from the state and potentially the FBI. That was the deal. Both sides agreed to it. And yet, more than a month later, it still hasn't happened. According to reporting, investigators demanded that the Wells family hand over the phone earlier this month, but the family said they were out of town. Nolan's mother has said his friends had custody of the phone initially, and that she was able to get it into her possession the night he went missing. Attorney Ben Crump, representing the family, has publicly stated that they are not refusing to comply. They're pushing for the joint examination they originally agreed to, instead of simply handing the phone over to authorities to examine on their own. According to Crump, the reasoning is straightforward. They want it done properly, with both sides watching every step. So there's no question later about what was found, what wasn't, or whether anything was altered in the process. Crump sent a letter to the Jackson County District Attorney's Office, giving them 4 possible dates to choose from for the examination. A window between August 18th and August 21st, according to that letter, which was reported by local television affiliate WKRG. In that letter, Crump wrote, and I'm paraphrasing his public statement here, that the family remains eager to move forward with the joint forensic examination that was agreed to back on July 15th, that their experts are on standby, and that the family wants the phone examined at a digital forensics lab at Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College. Why that specific location? That's not entirely clear from public reporting. It could be about neutrality, logistics, or simply a facility the family's experts already trust. What is clear is that the family has been publicly pushing to get this scheduled, in writing, with specific dates, for weeks. So as of this recording, we are sitting at more than 40 days since Nolan's body was found, and more than a month since both sides agreed in principle to examine this phone, and it still hasn't happened. That delay is the part of this case that even neutral observers, people with no stake in either side, find hard to understand. Which is exactly why I wanted to bring in someone who actually does this kind of work for a living. I sat down with Jake Green. He spent years in law enforcement before moving into the private sector, where he now specializes in mobile device forensics, literally the science of extracting, preserving, and interpreting data from phones like Nolan's. I wanted to ask him plainly, given how much time has passed, is this phone still useful? And if the family and investigators can't agree on how to examine it, what actually happens to the evidence while they argue? I opened by asking Jake how much he thought this case would ultimately come down to the phone, compared to everything else being discussed publicly. The boat, the distress call, the witness statements. He told me that in cases like this, the phone is a critical piece of evidence, especially when you're dealing with teenagers on a boat. His point was simple. Where there are teenagers, there are almost certainly multiple iPhones on that boat, and those phones carry databases tracking roughly the last 30 days of usage. Since we're now beyond that 30-day window, he said, everything comes down to one question. Has the device actually been properly preserved by whoever has custody of it? I asked him to walk me through what investigators could hope to find on Nolan's phone specifically. He explained that they could potentially retrace pieces of messages that were deleted, applications that were opened, even whether Snapchat itself was opened around the time Nolan went missing, which lines up with that detail Nolan's mother mentioned about the empty Snapchat history. Jake's point was that even if something was deleted, forensic tools can sometimes retrace those steps. Who Nolan was talking to after he went into the water, what applications were opened, what communications were sent, what was deleted. But, and this is the part that matters, the more time that passes, the less likely those items can be recovered. That's the clock this entire dispute has been racing against. I brought up the fact that the family has said the phone may have been tampered with, and that they've also demanded digital records from 5 different tech platforms: Meta, TikTok, Snapchat, WhatsApp, and Life 360. I asked him, if someone deleted messages off the phone itself, could investigators still see them through those platforms? Jake explained that it all depends on what data actually synced back to the cloud. If Nolan's phone maintained a cellular signal or connected to Wi-Fi, and that data synced up, then you're dealing with what's called a data destruction period, a window before that data is permanently gone. He gave a specific, sobering example. In a recent case he worked, Google was found to maintain certain deleted data for roughly 48 hours after the actual deletion occurs. If law enforcement isn't fast enough to issue a preservation request to a company like Google immediately following an incident, that data can be lost forever, which makes the physical phone itself even more crucial, assuming it's been properly powered down and preserved. I asked specifically about Apple, about text messages and iMessage, since that's what most people picture when they think about checking a phone. He confirmed that deleted messages can sometimes still be recovered, but again, it depends entirely on how the device has been handled. The more the phone continues to be used, sending new messages, running apps, the more likely that old data gets overwritten. But there are technical areas within the messaging database, what's called a journaling file or write-ahead log, that can still hold traces of deleted messages, as long as the phone hasn't been in continuous use since. He said if you're looking a year out, recovery becomes much less likely, but there are other data sources, like notification histories, that could still show that a message was sent or received even if the message content itself is gone. I asked him to explain what he meant by notification histories, because I think a lot of people don't realize this even exists. He told me that iPhones specifically maintain a database tracking your most recent contacts. So even if you delete a message thread or a call log entry, there are areas within the operating system that continue tracking that activity regardless of what the user does on the surface. In other words, deleting something from view doesn't necessarily mean it's gone from the device entirely. I asked about Snapchat directly, since the whole premise of the app is that content disappears. Could investigators actually recover snaps that might tell more of the story? He said that historically, results have been inconsistent. Sometimes that data is recoverable from the phone itself, sometimes it isn't, and it's changed over the years as Snapchat has updated how it stores information. There's no guarantee either way. But the first and most important step, in every scenario he described, is the same. The initial preservation of the device has to happen before any of this becomes possible. Since Jake now works in the private sector, and since the Wells family has said they're bringing in their own independent experts, I asked him to explain what that process actually looks like when it's not law enforcement running the show. He said that for private clients, whether it's a civil case, an insurance case, or a situation like this one, his team performs what's called a full file system extraction of the device. That process essentially preserves everything on the phone in its current state, so that even if the physical device is lost, damaged, or destroyed later, investigators can still go back to that extraction months or even years down the line and continue analyzing it. From there, they can begin reconstructing a timeline of app activity, establishing who was in contact with whom, and identifying whether anything appears to have been deleted during specific windows of time. That, he said, is exactly the kind of full file system extraction he'd hoped to see come out of a joint inspection between the family's private investigators and government investigators on Nolan's phone. I also asked him about GPS, whether investigators could pinpoint exactly where the phone had been. He confirmed that yes, you absolutely can recover precise location history, but again, it all comes back to preservation. He gave an example from his own casework. An attorney once seized a phone from an accident scene, but kept it powered on, sitting in a desk drawer for an extended period. When his team finally analyzed it, most of the GPS data they recovered was from that attorney's office, not from the actual accident scene, because the phone had continued generating new location data the entire time it sat there, overriding what came before. That's why I asked him directly, is turning the phone off actually the best thing you can do with a piece of evidence like this? He said yes, as long as you know the passcode. Powering the device down immediately is typically the single best step you can take to preserve. Given his background in both law enforcement and search and recovery work, I asked Jake for his broader take on the case. Not just the phone, but the overall circumstances. He pointed out that for teenagers today, essentially their entire life exists online, which is exactly why the electronic records from all of these platforms, combined with the physical devices themselves, are going to be central to reconstructing what actually happened. He also brought up his own experience as a former rescue diver involved in search and recovery operations, explaining that bodies typically do not resurface immediately after an incident. There are scientific factors involved, including decomposition, gas buildup, water temperature, and what a person was wearing, all of which affect the timeline of when and where a body is eventually found. Based on that experience, he said the timing of when Nolan's body was located by a park ranger was, in his assessment, consistent with what he'd expect scientifically, though he was careful to frame this as his professional read on the physical evidence, not a conclusion about what happened to Nolan. I also asked whether investigators could pursue the phones belonging to the friends who were with Nolan that night. He confirmed that law enforcement can issue a search warrant for those devices once they're identified, but made the same point again. We are now more than 30 days out, and if those phones have been in continuous use, or if a device was traded in at a carrier store, that data could already be gone. I closed our conversation by asking what he thought was most important going forward. His answer was straightforward: reconstructing the exact timeline of when Nolan went missing and determining what messages were deleted, sent, or altered. Social media, text messages, call logs, all of it, he said, is going to matter. Now let's talk about the other major development in this case, the grand jury. We know there was a private, inconclusive autopsy that the Wells family had conducted independently. The official, state-conducted autopsy results have not been released, and from what's being reported, they're expected to remain sealed until the grand jury process concludes. For a lot of viewers, that raises an obvious question. Why all the secrecy? Why can't we know more about what investigators have found so far? To break this down properly, I spoke with Judge Terica Nunes Navarro, who walked me through exactly how a grand jury operates and why the process looks the way it does. I asked her directly, is this level of secrecy normal for a case like this? She said yes, it's fairly standard procedure. Grand juries are intentionally secretive, and that secrecy exists to protect several groups at once: the people accused, witnesses who testify, and anyone the grand jury calls in during the process. Even after a grand jury concludes its work, those protections largely remain in place. Nothing like what happens once a case is formally charged and becomes public record. Part of the reasoning, she explained, is practical. It gives authorities time to take an accused person into custody before they have the opportunity to flee, once charges are actually filed. I asked her to explain, in plain terms, what a grand jury actually is for people who've never encountered one. She described it as functioning like a regular trial jury, ordinary members of the community, selected no differently than you'd be selected for any other jury duty. You simply receive a summons. The major difference, she said, is that once you're part of a grand jury, you are not permitted to discuss what happens inside that room with anyone. The confidentiality protections are far more stringent than what applies to a standard trial jury. I asked whether a single grand jury would typically only handle one case, like Nolan Wells, or multiple cases at once. She said that depends on the state, but typically grand juries review multiple cases during their term, not just one. I asked her to explain how the actual process works. She described the grand jury as holding both subpoena power and investigative power, reviewing the case, asking what additional information is needed, examining the autopsy, and interviewing witnesses and law enforcement directly. In essence, she said, the members become citizen investigators, functioning as a deliberate barrier between law enforcement and the accused. I asked the obvious follow-up. At the end of that process, do they decide whether to bring charges? She confirmed that a grand jury doesn't convict anyone. They recommend whether or not charges should be filed. This is where I pushed a little harder because I think it's a question a lot of you watching have been asking. Given how many people feel like this investigation hasn't been handled properly, and given that there's already a sense that something feels off about how this has unfolded, is the grand jury process actually fair? Isn't it essentially controlled by the prosecution, with no one from the victim's side able to participate directly? She pushed back gently on the framing of one-sided. Her answer was that the process is heavily protected and insulated from the public, and that insulation, uncomfortable as it might feel to a grieving family or an anxious public, is actually what allows it to be fair. If the process were transparent from the very beginning, she argued, it would compromise the investigation itself. The public simply isn't able to watch a grand jury deliberate and request evidence in real time. She did acknowledge, though, that structurally, the process leans more toward the prosecutorial side by design. Naturally, I asked her about the cell phone situation directly, whether it was unusual, in her experience, for law enforcement to still not have possession of a key piece of evidence like this more than a month into an investigation. She said the grand jury itself has the authority to subpoena that phone directly and bring it in through their own process. Her guess, and she was clear that this was speculation on her part, was that law enforcement may be intentionally holding back from seizing the phone themselves because they don't want to overstep or interfere with whatever the grand jury is independently pursuing. She said she personally found it a little unusual, noting that if it were her call, she'd want the device secured in safekeeping regardless, but acknowledged that procedures vary significantly from state to state, and that law enforcement may simply be deferring to the grand jury's parallel authority. I asked for her broader impression of the case. She described it as heartbreaking, an awful situation for everyone involved. She noted that with attorney Ben Crump now representing the family, transparency demands are going to intensify, which she said explains a lot of the public scrutiny building around the grand jury process itself. She also pointed out that the involvement of a judge's child in the circumstances surrounding the case adds another layer of public attention. We also touched on something that's been circulating around this case. Reports of death threats directed at some of the other teenagers who were on the island that night. I raised the point that everyone, understandably, wants answers immediately, especially the family, but that a grand jury process fundamentally requires patience. She agreed completely, describing grand jury indictments as a tried and tested mechanism for fair accountability within the system, while acknowledging that if she were in the family's position, she would feel exactly the same urgency and frustration they're expressing publicly. I asked her to clarify how subpoena power actually functions during this window. She explained that the grand jury effectively becomes the investigative body during its term, with the authority to subpoena documents, forensic evidence, and testimony from anyone relevant to the case. She compared it to how jurors in a regular trial often surprise attorneys with sharp, unexpected questions once deliberations begin, precisely because a grand jury is made up of everyday people from every walk of life, which, in her view, is exactly what makes the process valuable, a genuine diversity of perspective examining the evidence. Toward the end of our conversation, I raised something that comes up constantly in true crime cases like this. The difficulty some people have accepting that a tragedy might have been an accident, even when the evidence points that way, and how that dynamic can sometimes create unfairness for other people caught up in the story. She responded with real empathy, noting that as a parent, you can never fully know how you'd react in the family's position, especially given the discrepancies that have been reported around Nolan's location that night and the now widely discussed phone call to his mother, a moment where she reportedly asked where her son was, only to be met with confusion from the other side of the call, since they believed he was supposed to be with her. The judge noted that whenever you're dealing with multiple teenage witnesses, some level of suspicion about whether something was truly accidental is almost inevitable. I asked if she had anything else to add before we wrapped up. Her closing thought was simple: patience is going to be essential here. With Crump now heavily involved, she expects independent forensics and an independent autopsy to be pursued aggressively, every detail double-checked. And she believes law enforcement is fully aware that their own work is going to be scrutinized just as closely as a result. We also briefly discussed the criticism Crump has faced for how publicly he handles cases like this. Her response was direct. It's hard to fault him, because the family has a constitutional right to legal counsel and to ask hard questions of investigators. And having representation that insists on transparency simply means law enforcement is going to be held to a higher standard of thoroughness throughout. So let's bring this all together. As of this recording, the NAACP has also become formally involved in the Nolan Wells case, with their own legal counsel now looking into the circumstances alongside the family's team. But realistically, there are two major developments this entire case is currently waiting on. First, the official, state-conducted autopsy. We know the private autopsy the family commissioned came back inconclusive. The official results exist, but they are not being released publicly. And from what's been reported, they're expected to stay sealed until the grand jury process plays out. Second, the phone. And based on everything we just walked through, from the timeline, to the digital forensics experts' breakdown of what could still be recovered, to the very real data destruction windows that are actively working against this investigation the longer it drags on. This is not a small detail. This is potentially the single most important piece of physical evidence in the entire case. The fact that, as of this recording, that phone still has not been jointly examined. More than 40 days after Nolan's body was found, and more than a month after both sides agreed in principle to examine it together, is, frankly, hard to wrap your head around. But based on Ben Crump's letter to the Jackson County District Attorney, there does appear to be real movement, with a proposed window between August 18th and August 21st for the examination to finally take place. I'll be watching closely, and the moment there's confirmation that this exam has actually happened, or the moment the grand jury reaches any kind of decision, I will have a full update here breaking down exactly what it means. I want to say thank you, genuinely, to everyone who has stuck with this case alongside me. I know how emotionally exhausting it can be to follow a story like this one, where there's this much public attention, this much grief, and still so few concrete answers. I want to be really clear about something before we end. No one has been charged in connection with Nolan Wells' death. The official autopsy has not been released. Everything covered in this video reflects publicly available statements, reporting, and expert analysis as of the date of this recording, not confirmed conclusions about what happened to Nolan. If this video helped you understand where this case actually stands, beyond the noise, beyond the speculation, do me a favor and hit subscribe, and turn on notifications if you haven't already. This is exactly the kind of case where the next update could come at any time, and I want you to be the first to know when it does. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Respectfully, please. This is a real family going through the worst thing imaginable, and I'll see you in the next one.